Welcome to yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In this series of lectures, we'll look at cost management in projects. There's three parts. The first one, in the introduction, we'll just talk about a couple of types of costs. In the second part, we'll talk about three methods for cost estimation. And finally, in the third lecture, we'll introduce terms around earned value management. As with all the knowledge areas, there are processes which are divided into process groups. The cost management is no different. Since PMBOK 5, 2014, every process or every knowledge area has a preliminary planning of cost management in this case. So that belongs to planning. Estimating costs and determining budgets are a little bit like the schedule that we just had done in previous lectures. That is, first we estimate the cost of every activity or every work package, and here we bring in some reality to determine the whole project budget to decide when we will do things to suit things like cash flow, etc. Like scheduling, we finally authorise a cost baseline. Now, that's just not a total budget, that's actually how much money is spent on each activity. And because that's aligned with schedule, that means how much money is spent during each period. And because that's aligned with scope, that means how much money is spent on delivering every part of scope. And that's how we get this idea of cost controls, which are in monitoring and controlling. Those cost controls look at our performance against our cost baseline, but our cost baseline is on what is the money spent, so what part of scope, and when is that money spent, so when in the schedule, and bringing those three, schedule, scope and cost together for monitoring is this term earned value management, so EVM. So earned value management takes the notion that every time you complete a part of work, you're earning value for the project sponsor. So managing that value is the way that we can look at cost controls. Yeah, we'll deal with that in lecture 6C. When we think about budgeting a project, we need to think about making sure that we have accurate cost estimates for each component of the project as well as the whole project, in total. Accurate estimating of costs will help us decide what funding is required. So it helps us secure funding for the project. So make it realistic, that's the funding that you'll be seeking. And also, when we develop a budget, this baseline that we're talking about, what are we spending the money on, when is it being spent, that really helps us with monitoring, controlling and reporting our costs. For large projects, financing is a big issue, it's a major issue, and so understanding our cash flows, so when the money is needed to earn more value on the project, is an essential part of budgeting for a project. So a cost management plan is a document that sets out the activities and criteria for planning, structuring, and controlling the project costs. Estimating costs, in the next lecture we'll talk about three types of cost estimation, but right now it's this idea of, same as schedule, be honest, develop a realistic budget and communicate that realistic budget to key stakeholders. So when we think about costs, we think about what types of costs are we estimating for, when those costs will occur, what methods we might use, and that's related to the timing and the accuracy of the cost estimates required, and finally any other issues. So we'll cover the methods used to estimate costs and the time and the accuracy in lecture 6B, but for the moment we're dealing with the types of cost. Here's a list of possible you know, types of costs that are on occur in the project. Perhaps one that you remember from labs is you've got labour cost and material cost. And you see how we can make and purchase, or we can lease. We have a cost estimate, so that's the activity that's ongoing, and we also may have a cost reserve. In this lecture, we'll concentrate on these two dichotomies. Firstly, fixed and variable cost, and direct and indirect cost. So fixed costs are those things that remain the same throughout the project, whether we build 2 stories on the house or 1 story. Certain things like gaining approval or the land, the price of the land is independent of the amount of work that occurs on the project. Variable costs are things like labour. The more work you do, the bigger the cost. For both fixed and variable costs, it's one thing to think about, laying bricks or creating the foundation or putting in windows, things that build the scope, things that build the bridge. They're called product or product scope. So things that are building the bridge. Don't forget, you've also got your project scope. So the meetings, the reporting, the gaining approvals, all those other things actually do cost the project money. So it's not enough to just cost out, digging holes. You also need to think about the reporting requirements, the management requirements, so the project scope. Direct versus indirect, well, it's pretty simple. When we create a task like lay 10,000 bricks, we have direct costs. We need bricks and we need Bob. So there are direct costs. So we can think of those in terms of material, travel, consultants, subcontractors, parts that we purchase, things that we make. All these things are direct costs. Each activity is assigned labour and materials. Indirect costs are the overheads. They would be related to multiple projects. So that the cost of having an office would be allocated across multiple projects. There are different ways of doing that, but typically organisations have a percentage estimate of what the overhead is. So every dollar we spend on direct costs might mean about 30% of indirect costs. So things like the office staff salaries, having a building, maintaining a lease, the insurance that occurs across multiple projects, all those are indirect costs. They're not actually related to this project, but they're related to all the projects an organisation may undertake, and that's allocated across those projects. So here's an example of a work package with direct and indirect costs. And you can see here we've got the direct labour, the program and the system analysis, system architecture, and that's the labour cost. We also have the material costs that are allocated to this work package. And finally, we have an overhead cost. So what we're saying is, of those indirect costs, we're allocating 60% extra, additional, over and above the direct labour costs. So there's the direct labour costs. We're allocating a 60% infrastructure charge, we like to call it the university, but it's the cost of doing business across multiple projects. Regular versus expedited. So regular cost is simply, if you like, Bob's earning $50 an hour. If we want Bob to work on the weekends, we may have to pay an overtime charge. If we want to expedite or speed things up, there may be extra charges involved. And that's all we need to say about that. And finally, we were talking about estimate versus contingency, which is further down in the list, is that each activity that we do, we estimate a cost. So every activity has a labour and materials cost assigned to it, and may also have an indirect cost. So we have internal labour, external labour, materials, and an overhead. But then we have another section which is called a contingency. That's where either our cost estimates might be too small, or a risk may occur on the project, in risk management, we're going to call that passive acceptance of risk. That means that we just have a slush fund ready to pay out risks as they occur. So that reserve is able to be used to mitigate against cost underestimates or risk. So to improve against our cost and schedule risk. What usually happens is a 10 to 20% reserve is kept, if we're being official about this, by the sponsor. So the sponsor will pay the project the estimated cost, and then hold on to the contingency cost, and which the project or the project manager can request that that contingency cost comes into the project. However, that's only really for some types of contracts. Not that we're doing procurement in this series of lectures, but other types of contracts, what we call fixed cost contracts, actually the project manager or the project team take on the risk. And in fact, what they do is they have a 20% float or profit margin, and that contingency is used from that profit margin. So the more the contingency is used, the less the profit margin. So where cost estimates are wrong or where risks occur bites into the project delivery organisation, which is why it's really important, we come to this in 6C, that protecting that reserve, protecting the reserve is most successful when we have tight cost controls on our project. Short video by Todd Hutchinson. Todd's from Perth, as we've said, and in this video he just looks at basically those direct and indirect costs, so internal labour, external labour, as well as overheads or infrastructure charges, and then he talks about reserves or contingencies. So I'll let you have a look at that. I'll be back with 6B, which looks at types of cost estimation.